thanks all for coming. This is a great opportunity for me just to also have an exchange. The Conservancy, I'll tell you a little bit about me first, but the Conservancy, I would say, is newly engaged in this area. So I hope this is the start of a conversation more than anything else. So I just want to put you on notice that I expect you to ask me questions, and hopefully not too hard, and that we can sort of get a dialogue going between the Centre, between SMI and the Nature Conservancy about the way in which we work with the mining sector in particular. So a little bit more about me, and thanks, David, for the intro. I actually studied here at Griffith in my undergraduate, and then went straight into the mining industry. But it's been a long time since I've actually engaged directly, in tailings and acid mine drainage issues and air pollution and health, which was my bread and butter, I guess. For about a decade I was doing air pollution, health, noise, urban planning work. Then I got involved in work outside Australia. So I spent the first 10 years inside Australia, and for the last 20 I've been working really more on the way in which conservation and development work together, or not. In the last 10, it's really been about where conservation, how relevant is conservation to a lot of the development questions that the world is facing. And most of that work that I've been engaged in has been in our backyard, if you like, in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. So that's where I have most of my knowledge. I've spent a lot of time building the international policy environment within which we do a lot of our work. I negotiated climate change for a long time, the Convention on Biodiversity. So a lot of policy on paper that I've spent a lot of time recently with the Conservancy trying to get to actual action or implementation on the ground. And that's where my work with conservation leadership, political leadership has come to the fore, and more recently now with how do we engage the corporate sector, particularly mining. And as I'll run through here, there's some very interesting challenges where high-value conservation and mining are coming together in the same space. So let me run through this presentation, and forgive me if I refer to notes, because I am a little bleary, and I will try and give a reasonable representation of this presentation. This is the Nature Conservancy's footprint. The Nature Conservancy, for those who don't know, is probably one of the world's largest non-profits, conservation non-profits. We spend about $500 million annually. Most of that is in the US, and about 100 million of that is spent in around 30 countries globally. It's not the brand, obviously, that WWF and others has, but it is a big non-profit, mostly raising private capital from the US, so it's a philanthropic organization, and that money is then spent internationally. This is our footprint in Asia-Pacific, China and Mongolia, through into Southeast Asia, mostly in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Micronesia, and obviously in Australia. These blobs that you see, the blue and the green blobs, are more sort of spheres of influence where we're running programs around forests or marine resources, and I'm going to run through that now. Our focus really is how do we accelerate the transition to sustainable development. So it's, as I said, that nexus between conservation and development. We have four main areas of focus: conservation lands, or conserving critical lands, and this is particularly in northern Australia, here in the Asia-Pacific region. We do a lot of work on indigenous protected areas. Again, it's the same model as the Conservancy has had since it started in the 1950s, which is around private lands conservation. So how do you supplement what is going on through public conservation efforts, through what the government might do to engage in private lands conservation? Most recently, that's involved helping the purchase of Fish River Station, which is in the Northern Territory, which is about 450,000 acres. It's about half the size of Colorado. Now, I use Colorado mostly because these presentations go to a US audience. And so when you say half the size of the state of Colorado, people go, oh, wow. For this audience, that really, I watched and was kind of like, oh, yeah, Colorado. You know, who one, who cares, and two, really, what's the size of Colorado anyway? But if I said half the size of Western Australia, you'd take notice. And I think that for a US audience, that's the impact that we often need to have. Because as I said, a lot of the giving is from the US. Restoring our oceans, we work in two big areas. One is the Coral Triangle, just to the north of Australia. This is Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, East Timor, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea, but it's basically where 75% of the world's marine biodiversity sits. This is not to do with mining, but ultimately there will be some seabed mining involved. In fact, there already is, and we're engaged in trying to help figure out some of that at a very preliminary level. I'm just going to whiz through this because I want to get to the juicier mining discussion. In China, securing fresh water, we spend a lot of time in the Yangtze just because it's really what the Yangtze provides in terms of energy to China, and the future energy demand is extraordinary. And we're working closely with the state-owned enterprises and the government to figure out how that expansion can be done in a somewhat balanced way. I don't want to overblow any outcomes there in terms of getting it absolutely right. And the fourth area is climate change and reducing the impacts of climate change. Because of the significant impact of deforestation and the role deforestation plays in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases, we're working closely with a number of countries around the world on figuring out what reduced emissions from deforestation can actually do to help reduce the threat of climate change. What that means really in Indonesia, we're working, this is a country where 80% of their emissions come from deforestation. And they are the third largest emitter globally. So it's really worth trying to figure that out. But the sorts of tools and techniques we bring to that have to do with a lot of land use decision making, and in fact many of the tools that we use in relation to deforestation, understanding where high value conservation sits with the sorts of development options there may be in that area, is very similar to what we also are trying to do in relation to mining. And that brings us to a catchy phrase, development by design. And it's only catchy because it doesn't say a lot, except that we have a tendency in our organization, being a large conservation non-profit, to figure out how to market what we're doing. So forgive me the sort of these catchy phrases. We started with conservation by design. And so someone came up with the idea that, well, why don't we just call it development by design? I'm not sure how much design is actually in this, but I'm going to run you through a small video, if you wouldn't mind, spending 3 minutes just watching a video rather than listening to me, because this kind of summarizes development by design.
We live in an age of unprecedented growth. Over the past several decades, global population has doubled and is projected to reach 9 billion by 2050, putting tremendous pressure on our food, water, energy, and mineral resources. In this rapidly changing world, the Nature Conservancy is using its development by design approach, helping governments, companies, and communities to make better, more balanced development decisions based on their impacts to people, wildlife, and our natural world.
There's a lot of investment coming in Latin America. So the ministries of environment, they want to do things right. They want to create development with a less amount of impact. We have the tools to make it happen. We have been partnering with the governments, there is trust with the governments, and we have the track record with proof of concepts on the ground, so it's a win-win situation.
Gracias a la colaboración de TNC y todo el apoyo técnico que hay detrás de este gran equipo, hemos logrado montar un nuevo esquema de compensaciones para proyectos de infraestructura y para proyectos mineroenergéticos. Este nuevo esquema de compensaciones permite tener una mayor claridad con respecto a cuáles son los factores de compensación, es decir, dónde se debe compensar, cómo se debe compensar y cuánto se debe compensar.
Development by design, the landscape level planning, is a tool that helps you assess the pros and cons of decision making and get the balance right. For organisations like Rio Tinto, TNC brings a number of benefits. One is scientific expertise, so that's a key part. It's access to good science. We're not a conservation organisation, we're a mining company. We manage our footprint as best we can. When we close an operation, our aim is for the biodiversity and the biodiversity conservation in that region to be better off than when we first walked in. So from a practical point of view, it's access to a partner that can work with us in terms of the delivery on the ground.
We know what it is to sacrifice our lands in Wyoming for production, but we also know what it is to preserve them for the values that are rooted in our American culture, and we're a balance of these things. Part of development by design is to identify areas in our state where we have these high wildlife values and low energy potential. These places, they also have this ecosystem function for our country and for our communities, and it's a significant privilege to be able to manage and operate a large landscape like this. What I believe I'm doing is something in the long term will be recognized as a significant effort for our heritage. I hope my sons get to benefit from that.
Working together, we can make smarter choices today that will impact the future of our planet. Join the conversation.
So excuse the pitch, if you know, but that gives you a sense of the range of places we work, the sorts of partners we work with, and I hope it didn't come across as too much of a sales job. That's just our marketing department and how we do it. So let me now switch back to where we were, and I'll kick off again. So here's the vision. Our long-term vision is for energy and mining and infrastructure development to provide the net positive impact for nature and people through smarter mitigation. So it's this emphasis on net positive impact, and we try there are a number of ways or strategies we're adopting, which would be great to get your kind of feedback on and to sort of interrogate what we're doing a little. These are the four that we're focusing on at the moment. One is to get a sort of a global alliance of key partners that are prepared to work towards net positive impact. And I'm going to run through some of those in a second and where we are with that. Then there's the policy change and replication. So where can we find in countries, which I'll run through, Mongolia and the Solomon Islands in particular, where we can take particular activities and particular investments and leadership and get the sort of policy shift at a national level. So try and not run series of projects, but really figure out what is it that we can do to engage the government in any of these sorts of investments to say, okay, how do we raise the bar here and actually get adoption of the right sorts of standards and the principle of net positive impact. We're looking for a corporate-driven strategy for sector-wide change. So it's finding those corporate leaders and enough within the sector to try and shift the way in which that sector operates. And the last is lending performance standards, so that, and I'll get to that in a second. This is the Net Positive Impact Alliance so far, and it's in its initial stages. The IUCN is the World Conservation Union, for those that are not sure, the International Finance Corporation, Shell, Rio Tinto, and ourselves. We're looking for, in this alliance, demonstration sites. So actually, this has got to be grounded in something that where we're actually showing what works and what doesn't. There needs to be more peer-reviewed science around what we're doing. So there's actually a solid base for the alliance to advocate in for the best sorts of investments. We're looking at how we run that out through particular companies, looking for the sorts of networks of companies like ICMM and the Equator banks, the Equator principles, those banks that have adopted the Equator principles, to try and work with them so that if we have one leading corporate, how can they take that and influence others more widely. Here's a snapshot. So in figuring out what strategies we needed to work with, we've also done a fairly coarse analysis of, in red is the areas of future development risk, and that is energy, mining, infrastructure development, the sort of three broad areas. I mean, there are all sorts of development risks. It's a very loose term, but it's looking at those three main areas. The yellow ones are the current landscapes within which we are working. So, for example, you probably can't read this, but there's hydro in Mexico, oil and gas in this area. In the Great Plains, we're looking at wind energy, Central Appalachians shale gas. Venezuela is offshore oil and gas. And then the blue areas, here is mining in West Australia, working with Barrick Gold and BHP. And Mongolia, you saw the example in the video. The blue areas are areas where we're thinking about expanding, including mining in Gabon and Zambia. The Solomon Islands, which I'm going to run through shortly. There's questions around mining in Indonesia, where we're doing that work on avoided deforestation. The Indonesian government is actually more concerned about what's under the ground rather than the trees that are on top of it. Kalimantan, which is the area we work in, is actually slated for energy development rather than for forestry, for example. We're also starting to think about shale gas in China and shale gas in Argentina. So there is an enormous range of areas, geographies, or landscapes that we're working or potentially working in. And whilst we're a large non-profit, we're not, this has to be done in partnership. These are areas where we think we have good traction around an issue with some partners, but we will have to do a lot of work to be able to successfully build out any of these, particularly the areas in blue. And please don't ask me too many hard questions about any one of these because I'm not an expert in what's going on in the Americas at all. And the African mining questions are still quite open. But let me run through a couple of places where we're working, just to give you a little more detail. I don't know, has anyone been to Mongolia? There you go, too. Well, you know, well, if you do get a chance, seriously, it's an astounding grassland landscape, and it is like this. Not everywhere, but it's really stunning. I mean, without fences, it's fantastic. But what the work we're doing here is really, as you can see, it's about making the right connections with people in the different areas within which we need to, from community groups through to the government and the mining industry. What's been important in this, and there's a number of, if you like, dot points or lessons that we've drawn away. The good science has been bringing science into this sort of equation. I think and I've forgotten his name from Rio Tinto, mentioned this. It's actually bringing some science from a group that perhaps is seen as, whilst we're a conservation organisation, we're not from the mining industry, so we kind of come in somewhere where we're different and we're not being employed by the mining industry to present information. So it kind of, there's a little bit of, I think, a useful sort of honest broker role or an ability to sort of present that information in a way that is taken up quite well by all parties. A lot of time is spent on stakeholder engagement and participation, a lot of education work with local communities. And I think let me see if I can point out. So this is actually our country director, Ngtuya Oidev. She was actually the first woman politician or MP, sorry, not politician, in Mongolia, and she's been able to make the sorts of connections that are needed, but also our whole team there is Mongolian, so it's being able to understand the cultural and ethical issues around providing information and engaging the different groups effectively. I think that's also been an important lesson. In the Solomon Islands, this is obviously a different situation, similar in that it's a developing country, but Solomon Islands is a least developed country, so it really is a challenging environment in which to work to get the right sort of information to the right level and to have a conversation amongst parties where everybody actually understands what's going on. The Solomon Islands, as a little bit of background, has largely got its foreign exchange through selling trees, basically cutting down its forests. It's probably got, 5, maybe 10 years left of commercial forestry. Mining development is the new wave. It's the next opportunity, and there are, I think, whilst it's a great opportunity, it's also a significant challenge. And I think what we're finding is it's a really important time in the Solomon Islands, to start to get this, to figure this out. Now, what's happened here? Let's see. Oh, we're back. Good. So, a couple of points. We've been working in the Solomon Islands for about 20 years. And actually, the Mining and Minerals Act there, I think, is about 20 years old as well, and really not effective. There's also the sense that there's just a lack of capacity within the government and at the national and provincial level to be able to manage the development of the mining industry effectively. What else do I want to say here? I'm going to move on to just give you a sort of a snapshot of the ways in which we might work as well as a conservation organization. We spend a lot of time, we're science-based, so we spend a lot of time gathering information about what's there, as well as building the relationships locally, and a lot of our work is in local communities. For example, this is an area where we spend a lot of time helping the communities actually understand climate change, which means, in that situation, helping them build a 3D model, literally a paper-based model in cardboard, and painting it up so that they can all find out where things are in villages that they've not been to. But so that's the kind of level of technology at the community level that we've been working with. And then, we bring to that the sort of digital information that helps them build that. Here you've got a picture of Choiseul province. The area in black are the mining sites. The area in dark brown is ironwood forest, which is particularly important biologically. So there's almost a direct correlation, largely because the ironwood actually needs lots of it's developed around nickel, or high concentrations of nickel, which is what these mining sites are. These are nickel mine deposits or mineral deposits. There are, whilst it's a developing country, there's lots of, the need for this information is critical, and you've got lots of existing interests in conservation. These areas in green are areas where the communities have already said these are particularly important places for us and we want to conserve them for different reasons. And what we're finding now is groups in this area have enough of an understanding of the biological significance of these places and the need to protect them, and not enough understanding of what a mine development would look like. And we've spent some time recently bringing groups from this area to Australia, actually, to look at mining that's developed here, and actually to meet with traditional owners here who've been through this process, and simply have an exchange with them to be able to understand what questions need to be asked. The benefits that have accrued as a result of mining development for those communities here in Australia, as well as the negatives. It's really been quite a valuable exchange that we've run recently. And when it comes to where you go from Choiseul to the national level, what you've got here is the Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Mines, Rents. Sorry, this is the quote from him. I've learned a lot from the Gold Ridge experience and not prepared to see a second mine developed in the country until best practices are in place. So in terms of the enabling conditions in the Solomon Islands at the moment, we feel there's a very good opportunity to connect some leadership in the field, some places where we can focus on net positive impact, get the right sorts of investments in place, and use that to help influence policy at a national level so that it can raise the standard for the mining sector across the board. So that's kind of that's in play now with a lot of uncertainties around it. There's definitely different views now within the community, pro-mining, anti-mining, different mining interests, competing miners who are suing each other in court and so on, or at least claiming they both were awarded tenements, and so it gets nice and complicated. But still, we think there's opportunity. So we're optimistic. And that gives us you a snapshot through slightly jet-lagged eyes, and I've probably missed chunks of information in here, but I'm hoping through your questions I might be able to remember them and answer those. So I'm going to stop there, so there's time for a conversation. As I said at the beginning, a conversation's important to me, and I'll leave it there.